There's a quote that has circulated across the internet for decades. It has been posted on financial forums, cited in books, recited in documentary films, and shared by everyone from libertarian economists to conspiracy theorists. It goes like this: "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country." And it is attributed to Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, supposedly said after he signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23, 1913. The problem is that no credible historian has ever found a verified primary source for that exact opening line. Researchers have traced it. Archivists have dug through Wilson's papers, his diaries, his correspondence, and what they found is something even more interesting than a fabricated quote. Because while the tidy, dramatic confession may be apocryphal, the real story underneath it, the actual record of what Wilson did, what he signed, what he enabled, what he suppressed, and what he ultimately failed to deliver, is far more damning and far more consequential than any single sentence. This is not a story about a quote. This is a story about a man who transformed the architecture of the United States in ways that echoed through every subsequent decade. A man who came into office promising freedom and delivered concentration, who campaigned on peace and sent hundreds of thousands of Americans to die in a European war, who called himself a progressive and dismantled the integrated civil service that Black Americans had spent 50 years building inside the federal government, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for a vision of international order that he then personally destroyed through his own stubbornness and pride, and who governed, in the final year of his presidency, as a ghost, incapacitated by a massive stroke hidden from the public, while his wife and a small circle of aides made decisions in his name. If Woodrow Wilson never said he was the most unhappy man who had unwittingly ruined his country, the evidence suggests he had more than enough cause to feel exactly that way. So let us go back to the beginning. Let us understand the world that produced him, the decisions he made, and the machinery he set in motion, because that machinery is still running today. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born on December 28, 1856, in Staunton, Virginia. He came into the world during the final convulsions of the antebellum South, the son of a Presbyterian minister named Joseph Ruggles Wilson and a devout woman named Janet Woodrow. His father had moved the family from Ohio to Virginia and was a committed supporter of the Confederacy. As a child, Wilson watched Confederate soldiers march past his window. He heard his father preach from a pulpit that had been surrounded by Confederate dead. He grew up inside the mythology of the lost cause, the idea that the Confederacy had been a noble civilization destroyed by Northern aggression, and that slavery itself had been a kind of paternalistic arrangement rather than a crime against humanity. This is not incidental background. This is the lens through which Wilson saw everything that came after. He wrote a 5-volume history of the United States that historians now recognize as a platform for lost cause ideology. It portrayed Black Americans as unfit for self-governance, described the Reconstruction era as a period of chaos and corruption imposed by radical Northern politicians, and treated the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s as a kind of necessary vigilante response to the disorder of the period. This was a man who, before he ever entered politics, had already constructed a worldview in which the social and political subordination of Black Americans was not merely acceptable. It was rational, scientific, inevitable. Keep that in mind. Wilson's academic career was extraordinary by almost any measure. He earned his doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, became a professor of political science, wrote prolifically, and eventually became the president of Princeton University in 1902. At Princeton, he implemented genuine academic reforms and elevated the institution's intellectual standing. He also, quietly but consistently, discouraged Black students from even applying to the university. In correspondence and in conversation, he made clear that Princeton was, in his vision, a white institution. He entered politics in 1910, winning the governorship of New Jersey. And then, in 1912, everything accelerated. The Republican Party fractured spectacularly when former President Theodore Roosevelt broke from incumbent President William Howard Taft and ran as a third-party candidate under the Progressive Party banner. With the Republican vote split cleanly down the middle, Wilson walked into the White House with just 42% of the popular vote. It was the lowest winning share since Abraham Lincoln in 1860, but it was enough. The Democratic Party, for the first time in 2 decades, controlled the White House and both chambers of Congress simultaneously. Wilson arrived in Washington with an agenda he called the New Freedom. It was built around 3 central targets. He wanted to smash the so-called triple wall of privilege, high protective tariffs, the unchecked power of big corporations, and the chaotic, crisis-prone system of American banking and currency. And in his first term, he attacked all 3 with a legislative velocity that astonished even his admirers. The first major victory was the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, passed in 1913, which achieved the most significant reduction in import duties since the Civil War. To offset the lost revenue from lower tariffs, the act introduced something that would transform American life permanently: a graduated federal income tax, made possible by the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution earlier that same year. The initial rates were modest. Incomes over $3,000 faced a 1% levy, rising to 7% on incomes over $500,000, but the structure was in place. The architecture had been built, and like all tax structures, it would expand. By 1917, income tax revenues had already surpassed tariff revenues entirely. A fiscal transformation of enormous magnitude had been accomplished quietly in the opening months of a single presidential term. The second and most consequential victory came in December of that same year. It came at the end of a process that had actually begun in secret, on an island off the coast of Georgia, 3 years before Wilson ever took office. In November of 1910, 6 men gathered at the Jekyll Island Club, a resort on a barrier island owned by some of the wealthiest families in America. They arrived separately, in disguise, using only first names. The men involved were Nelson Aldrich, a Republican senator from Rhode Island who chaired the Senate Finance Committee and was the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Then there was Arthur Shelton, Aldrich's personal secretary. Then A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Then Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Then Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York. And then Paul Warburg, a German-born investment banker and partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, who had spent years studying and writing about European central banking systems. They told their servants and any observers they were going duck hunting. They stayed for 9 days, and what they produced at Jekyll Island was a detailed blueprint for a central banking system for the United States. They knew that if the public learned the proposal had been drafted by the nation's most powerful bankers, it would be politically dead on arrival. So the plan was designed to look like reform. It was dressed in the language of government oversight and democratic accountability, even as its core architecture gave private banks enormous influence over the nation's money supply, interest rates, and credit conditions. The plan that emerged from that island was eventually defeated in Congress in its original form, known as the Aldrich Plan, because too many legislators, particularly in the populist wing of the Democratic Party, saw through the disguise. But the fundamental framework survived. When Wilson took office and pushed his own banking reform bill, the legislation that actually passed and that he signed on December 23, 1913, was described by historians as sharing technical language with the Aldrich Plan that was, in places, word for word identical. The political structure was different. There was a Federal Reserve Board with presidential appointees and 12 regional banks rather than one central institution. But the underlying mechanisms were essentially the same instrument wearing different clothes. What Wilson signed into law that night, 2 days before Christmas, with the Congress mostly empty and the public largely unaware, was the Federal Reserve Act. It created the Federal Reserve System, the central banking apparatus that has shaped American monetary life ever since. It gave a new institution, partly public, partly private, ultimately answerable to no elected official in any direct way, the power to control the money supply, set interest rates, and function as the lender of last resort to the banking system. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks were technically owned by their member banks. Private institutions held stock in the public central bank. Now, the real words that Wilson actually wrote, not the probably invented confession, but the verified text from his own published book, The New Freedom, which came out in 1913, are remarkable in what they reveal. He wrote, and these are his actual words, that a great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. He wrote that credit was concentrated, that the growth of the nation and all its activities were in the hands of a few men, who necessarily, by the very reason of their own limitations, chill and check and destroy genuine economic freedom. He called the money monopoly the great monopoly of the country. And he said that so long as it existed, the old variety and freedom and individual energy of development were out of the question. He was describing the very system he was about to create statutory infrastructure for, or perhaps the system he was trying, imperfectly, to reform. The debate about whether Wilson understood what he was constructing, or whether he genuinely believed the Federal Reserve represented a democratic check on concentrated financial power, is one historians have never fully resolved. What is not debatable is what happened afterward. In the decades following 1913, the Federal Reserve's early policies contributed to the conditions that made the Great Depression worse, not better. When the economy contracted in the early 1930s, the Federal Reserve tightened the money supply rather than expanding it, a catastrophic policy error that transformed a recession into a decade-long catastrophe. Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics and was not exactly a revolutionary firebrand, argued directly that the Federal Reserve turned the 1929 market crash into the Great Depression through its restrictive monetary policy. Since the Federal Reserve's creation, the purchasing power of the dollar has declined by roughly 97%. Whether one blames the Federal Reserve for this directly or simply notes it as a historical fact, it is impossible to look at what a dollar bought in 1913 and what it buys today without appreciating the scale of the transformation. But the Federal Reserve was only one front in the revolution Wilson was conducting. The second front was racial. When Wilson walked into the White House in March of 1913, he was the first Southerner elected president since Zachary Taylor in 1848. The African American community had cautiously supported him. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, had publicly endorsed Wilson and urged black voters to give him a chance. Wilson had made vague promises about justice and fairness. And in 1912, roughly 10% of the federal workforce was black, civil servants who worked alongside their white colleagues in an integrated environment that had been built piece by piece since the end of the Civil War. Within months of taking office, Wilson permitted his cabinet, dominated by white Southerners who, as one historian noted, were genuinely shocked to discover how integrated Washington's federal offices were, to begin systematically segregating every major department in the federal government. The post office was segregated. The Treasury was segregated. The Census Department, the Interior Department, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Navy, the Government Printing Office, the Marine Hospital, and the War Department, all segregated. Separate bathrooms were installed, separate cafeterias, separate workspaces. Photographs were now required with federal job applications, allowing supervisors to screen applicants by race before they ever walked through a door. Black workers who had reached senior positions over decades of service were demoted, harassed, or fired outright. The same class of black federal workers who had been 12 times more likely to be promoted than demoted under the Taft administration became, under Wilson, twice as likely to be demoted or fired as promoted. When civil rights activists protested, when W.E.B. Du Bois, who had publicly championed Wilson's election, wrote to him in outrage when a delegation led by William Monroe Trotter traveled to the White House in November of 1914, Wilson's response was extraordinary in its contempt. He told Trotter, apparently growing visibly angry during the meeting, that he was offended by Trotter's tone, that segregation was being implemented for the good of both races, to reduce friction. And then, according to multiple accounts, he had Trotter removed from the Oval Office. There was another moment that crystallized the atmosphere of the Wilson White House. In 1915, D.W. Griffith released a film called The Birth of a Nation. It was a technical masterpiece and a moral catastrophe, a 2.5-hour glorification of the Ku Klux Klan that depicted black men as bestial, portrayed white Southerners as heroic defenders of civilization, and used the sophisticated new grammar of cinema to embed racial hatred in a form of entertainment that millions of Americans would consume. It was screened at the White House. It was, by all historical accounts, the first motion picture ever shown at the White House. The Wilson administration later denied that the president had endorsed it, and Wilson distanced himself from the film as public backlash grew. But the fact of the screening, the fact that Griffith and his producers had requested it specifically because they knew Wilson's historical writings and believed he would be sympathetic, and the fact that it happened at all, these are not erased by a belated statement of discomfort. The Birth of a Nation triggered a massive revival of Ku Klux Klan membership across the country. Membership in the Klan, which had largely collapsed after Reconstruction, surged into the millions in the 1920s. The causal chain is not difficult to trace. By the time Wilson's second term began in 1917, the domestic transformation he had set in motion was well underway. The Federal Reserve existed, the income tax existed, the federal government had been resegregated, and now came the war. Wilson had won re-election in 1916, partly on the slogan that he had kept the country out of the European War. He had run as the peace candidate against the Republican Charles Evans Hughes, and then, in April of 1917, he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. The formal trigger was a combination of factors. Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, threatening American shipping. The Zimmermann telegram, a secret German diplomatic message intercepted by British intelligence, had proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico, offering Mexico the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in exchange for joining the war against the United States. And there were deep financial entanglements. American banks, most prominently J.P. Morgan and Company, had extended enormous loans to Britain and France, and a German victory would have made those loans worthless. Wilson's declaration of war was accompanied almost immediately by something that had nothing to do with fighting Germany. It was accompanied by a systematic assault on the civil liberties of the American people that stands as one of the most sustained episodes of government-sponsored suppression of free speech in the nation's history. The Espionage Act was passed in June of 1917. It criminalized interference with the war effort, obstruction of military recruitment, and attempts to cause insubordination in the armed forces. The penalties were severe, fines and prison terms of up to 20 years. But the law went further than targeting spies or saboteurs. The Postmaster General was given authority to block the mailing of any material deemed to oppose or question American military involvement in the war. Newspapers, pamphlets, journals, anything that challenged the war could be disappeared from the postal system, effectively silencing publications that depended on mail delivery. Wilson himself had pushed for even broader censorship provisions that Congress ultimately rejected as too extreme. He was not a reluctant participant in this process. He was the driving force behind it. Then came the Sedition Act of 1918. This was not a separate law. It was an amendment to the Espionage Act, and it was breathtaking in its scope. It made it a federal crime to use, in Wilson's government's own language, any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the United States government, its flag, or its armed forces. It criminalized speech that caused others to view the American government with contempt. It banned advocacy for anything that could be interpreted as undermining the war effort. The Postmaster General was further empowered. The Justice Department prosecuted with enthusiasm. What followed was the imprisonment of roughly 2,000 Americans. Not German saboteurs, not actual spies. American citizens who had spoken against the war, questioned the draft, criticized the government, or published material that the administration found inconvenient. Eugene Debs, the labor organizer and a Socialist Party leader who had run for president multiple times and received nearly 1 million votes in 1912, gave a speech in Canton, Ohio in June of 1918. He spoke about socialism, about the working class, and offered support for 3 men who had already been jailed for opposing the draft. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The Supreme Court unanimously upheld his conviction. In 1920, while sitting in a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Debs ran for president again and received nearly 1 million votes. Emma Goldman, the anarchist and labor activist, was arrested and deported to the Soviet Union. Hundreds of industrial workers of the world organizers were prosecuted and imprisoned. A man in Montana received a 20-year sentence for calling the war a capitalist scheme. A woman in Vermont was imprisoned for writing a letter to a newspaper questioning the war's justification. The machinery of political repression that Wilson built in the name of wartime necessity did not simply evaporate when the war ended. It mutated. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, with the enthusiastic assistance of a young Justice Department official named J. Edgar Hoover, launched the Palmer raids in 1919 and early 1920. Thousands of people were arrested in a single coordinated sweep. 556 people were deported. The targets were socialists, communists, anarchists, labor organizers, and immigrants, anyone whose politics made them suspicious in the eyes of a government that had spent 2 years convincing itself that dissent was disloyalty. The first Red Scare, as it came to be called, was a direct product of the legal and institutional infrastructure that Wilson had built to fight the Germans. He had constructed the architecture of political repression, and others used it. While all of this was unfolding at home, Wilson was also pursuing something that he genuinely believed was his greatest contribution to humanity. He believed, with an almost messianic intensity, that the Great War, which had killed somewhere between 17 million and 20 million people, could be transformed into something meaningful if the world agreed to build a new international order on top of its rubble. He articulated this vision in his famous 14 points, presented to Congress in January of 1918. The 14 points called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, reduction of armaments, self-determination for peoples under colonial rule, and, at the center of it all, the creation of a League of Nations, a permanent international organization where disputes between countries could be resolved without resort to mass slaughter. When the armistice ended the fighting in November of 1918, Wilson sailed to Europe. He was greeted in Paris and London and Rome by crowds that numbered in the millions. People wept in the streets. They threw flowers. They pressed against barricades just to see him pass. He was received as a kind of secular savior, the man from the Western Hemisphere who had arrived to redeem the old world from itself. It was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary receptions ever given to a foreign head of state in European history. And then the negotiations began, and the vision crumbled. The leaders of Britain, France, and Italy, David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, and Vittorio Orlando, were not interested in a just peace. They were interested in punishment, in territorial acquisition, in making Germany pay for every broken window and every dead soldier in an act of collective vengeance that was dressed up as justice. Wilson fought for his principles point by point. He compromised repeatedly, giving ground on self-determination here, on colonial administration there, in order to preserve his central demand, the League of Nations. He got it. The League's covenant was written into the first 26 articles of the Treaty of Versailles, signed at the Palace of Versailles on June 28, 1919. Germany was ordered to accept sole responsibility for starting the war. It was stripped of territory, its military was reduced to essentially a domestic police force, and it was required to pay reparations, damages whose total sum was not even specified in the treaty, but would later be set at 132 billion gold marks, a figure of such crushing magnitude that the German economy could not possibly sustain it. The terms of the Versailles Treaty created the conditions of humiliation, economic collapse, and national resentment that would, within 2 decades, produce Adolf Hitler, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and the Second World War. But Wilson's domestic battle for the League of Nations was, if anything, even more catastrophic than the compromises he had made in Paris. He returned to an America where the Republicans had taken control of both houses of Congress in the 1918 midterm elections. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, Wilson's long-standing intellectual and personal nemesis, chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lodge was not opposed to all international engagement. He and many of his Republican colleagues were open to the League with modifications, reservations that clarified American sovereignty and ensured that Congress retained its constitutional authority to declare war. These were not frivolous objections. They were legitimate constitutional concerns about whether Article 10 of the League Covenant committed the United States to military action in defense of other members without the consent of Congress. Wilson's response to this reasonable, negotiable opposition was to treat it as treason. He refused to discuss reservations. He refused to include any Republicans in the Paris peace delegation. He refused to consult Lodge before leaving for Europe, even though he would need Lodge's active cooperation to ratify anything he brought home. He called his opponents, in a flash of presidential contempt, contemptible, narrow, selfish, poor little minds that never get anywhere but run around in a circle and think they are going somewhere. And then, in a last desperate gamble, he decided to take his case to the American people directly. In September of 1919, a month after suffering what may have been a minor stroke, Wilson embarked on a whistle-stop tour across the country. He traveled more than 8,000 miles in 3 weeks. He gave 40 speeches. And then, after speaking in Pueblo, Colorado, on September 25th, reportedly delivering one of the most powerful addresses of his life, his voice cracking with what witnesses described as genuine emotion as he spoke about the soldiers whose sacrifice would be made meaningless if the peace failed, he collapsed on his train. He returned to Washington, and on October 2nd, 1919, Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke. The left side of his body was permanently paralyzed. He was largely confined to a wheelchair. His vision was severely impaired. His emotional regulation was compromised. His judgment, by most accounts, had been damaged in ways that made him more rigid, more paranoid, and more incapable of the flexibility that the political moment demanded. And for the next 17 months, until Warren Harding was inaugurated in March of 1921, the United States of America was governed by a man who could barely function. His wife, Edith Bowling Wilson, became the gatekeeper to the presidency. She decided what documents he would see, which visitors he would receive, and what information would be filtered or withheld. She later insisted that she had merely managed a kind of stewardship, relaying decisions and opinions on Wilson's behalf. But the practical reality was that the most powerful office in the world was being exercised by someone who had not been elected to it, on behalf of someone who was too ill to exercise it himself. The American public did not know. The press was told Wilson was resting after exhaustion. His physician, Cary Grayson, actively concealed the severity of the stroke. The vice president, Thomas Marshall, was kept entirely in the dark. The cabinet was not informed. The Congress was not informed. A constitutional crisis of the First Order was managed through concealment and misdirection. In this diminished, hidden state, Wilson directed his Democratic allies in the Senate to vote against any version of the Treaty of Versailles that included reservations. And so they did. The treaty was rejected twice, in November of 1919 and again in March of 1920. The League of Nations came into existence without the United States. The absence of American participation crippled the organization from its first day. The enforcement mechanisms that might have checked German rearmament, that might have made collective security a reality rather than an aspiration, were gone. The League spent the 1930s watching as Japan invaded Manchuria, as Italy invaded Ethiopia, and as Germany remilitarized the Rhineland and could do nothing meaningful to stop any of it. Wilson killed his own creation. He had staked his political identity, his physical health, and ultimately his sanity on the League of Nations. And then, through a combination of pride, stubbornness, and the cognitive impairment of a man who had suffered a devastating stroke, he personally ensured that it could not survive. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 while all of this was happening. Wilson left office in March of 1921, a broken man. He moved to a house on S Street in Washington, where he lived quietly, received occasional visitors, and experienced periodic improvements and declines in his health. He died on February 3rd, 1924, at the age of 67. His wife sent a note to Henry Cabot Lodge, who had been asked by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to attend Wilson's funeral as their representative. The note said, "Realizing that your presence would be embarrassing to you and unwelcome to me, I write to request that you do not attend. Even in death, the wounds were raw." So what are we to make of all this? What is the actual legacy of Woodrow Wilson? Not the sanitized textbook version, not the paranoid conspiracy version, but the honest, documented, historically verified accounting. He oversaw the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which centralized control of the American money supply in ways that Wilson himself acknowledged. In writing, concentrated enormous power in the hands of a small number of men. Whether that concentration has served the public interest or primarily served financial elites is a debate that economists and historians have conducted for more than a century without reaching consensus. He introduced the modern federal income tax structure, which has funded everything from public works to warfare to social programs, and which has grown in complexity and scope beyond anything imaginable in 1913. He segregated the federal government, setting back the economic and professional advancement of Black Americans by decades, reversing 50 years of post-Civil War progress in a matter of months. Princeton University removed his name from its School of Public and International Affairs in 2020, citing what it called his racist thinking and policies. Monmouth University renamed its Woodrow Wilson Hall. Schools in Washington, D.C. have debated removing his name from their buildings. He passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which resulted in the imprisonment of thousands of American citizens for the crime of speech, and which created legal precedents and institutional infrastructure for the suppression of dissent that echoed through the Palmer raids, through J. Edgar Hoover's decades-long surveillance of political activists, and through modern debates about the Espionage Act's application to whistleblowers. He brought the United States into the First World War, in which more than 116,000 Americans died and 204,000 were wounded. He negotiated a peace treaty whose punitive terms toward Germany helped create the conditions for the Second World War, in which somewhere between 70 million and 85 million people were killed. He built the League of Nations, and then personally destroyed its chances of effectiveness by refusing to compromise with a Senate that was, on the merits, making reasonable objections. And he governed for the final year and a half of his presidency, while incapacitated by a stroke that was concealed from the public, from the Congress, from his vice president, and from the constitutional processes designed to handle exactly this kind of crisis. The Woodrow Wilson Memorial Bridge, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, high schools named after him in cities across the country, an enduring presence in the American historical imagination as a progressive idealist, a war president, a dreamer who reached for a better world and fell short. What the famous confession gets right, even if Wilson never quite said it in those words, is the core truth that a man of formidable intelligence, genuine idealism, and catastrophic blind spots sat at the center of power at a hinge moment in history and made choices whose consequences he either did not foresee or could not control. He signed documents that redistributed power in ways that accumulated at the top. He championed liberty in his public speeches, while dismantling it in his administration's policies. He dreamed of a world free from war while building the resentments and structures that made the next war inevitable. There is something uniquely instructive about Wilson, and it is this. He was not a cartoonish villain. He was a deeply educated man who had spent his career thinking about power, democracy, and the relationship between government and the governed. He was capable of genuine compassion and genuine idealism. And yet the gap between his stated principles and his actual record is so vast, so documented, so historically verifiable, that it forces a reckoning with how thoroughly a person can believe in their own righteousness while systematically betraying the values they claim to hold. The quote may be invented. The story it was invented to tell is real. One family's financial ambition, captured in a secret meeting on a Georgia island, helped shape the central banking system of the world's largest economy. One man's racial ideology, rooted in a childhood spent inside a mythology of Confederate nobility, rolled back half a century of Black American progress inside the federal government. One administration's fear of dissent created legal tools for political repression that outlived every war they were designed to fight. One man's ego, combined with the physical devastation of a stroke and the institutional failure to acknowledge it, prevented the construction of the international order that might have stopped the deadliest conflict in human history. If you stayed until the very end of this one, leave a candle emoji in the comments. And if you find this kind of history worth exploring, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more to uncover. I will see you in the next one.